context and background and everything we're learning. That's the purpose of the blog here. Give you guys enough context to sort of know the directions you want to go with this material. So we're covering a whole lot of stuff. We're starting there. We're going to get a bit more specific. With Adam Smith, we've got economics, where we have sort of an idea of what that is. And then we'll take a test. We'll start critiquing economics, which then gets into some nitty-gritty about what's at stake. So we're getting there. But hopefully you see the themes. The notes are helping you sort of narrow down themes. You're looking at questions on the discussion boards, so you can start finding strategies about how you want to answer questions on the test. So if you're still panicking, whatever, I have office hours, I'll be glad to talk to you guys. Outside of those office hours, just how many people have study groups already? Figured out. Okay. So what we're going to do today is talk about, we're going to leave off of Vanderbilt and move on to precursors to the Enlightenment and public context. And I want to ask questions about this and understand to the extent that it interests you, so that we can understand where the Enlightenment comes. Because we're making a very sort of progressive argument about how these ideas of economics come out of a long history of humanity. And at the very end, very close to where we're at, economics emerges and everything gets really better. Right? So be careful of the comments telling you that economics is the solution to everything. And it's kind of my prerogative, because it's my discipline, that I can sort of give you the best spin on it possible. But be skeptical. And ask questions. So I'm going to start with Machiavelli. If you want to contrast to Vanderbilt, but you want to kind of get something that's trying to work with the same apparatus, maybe Machiavelli is a place to go. So I'm going to make an argument for why we should consider Machiavelli. Right? Political economy is both politics and economics. We're kind of studying political economy. It also has moral philosophy and psychology and some other stuff in there as well. So it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century where these things become distinct disciplines. So where we're looking for all of these ideas, we're looking to people who are writing about broad issues. So how many people kind of know Machiavelli a little bit? Just to give me an idea. Heard of him? Kind of know what he's famous for? You probably know The Prince, right? And it's 26 chapters, very short chapters. You can read it in like a week in a political science class. Right? If you're in one of the upper level political science classes, among other things. Nobody really pays attention to discourses on liberty, which is a shame because that's where all of his really interesting ideas about Republican virtue and all that kind of stuff are. Remember, The Prince was written when he was in prison. He wanted to get out of prison. So it was a very flattering book to his captors. And how can you seize control and maintain control here in Florence? So Machiavelli is writing in Florence. Florence is considered largely Republican, not at the time this book was written. And Machiavelli had a vision of Republican values that would lead eventually to a united Italy under a sort of Republican government. And he thought that would make it more prosperous and better and more stable and able to fend off attacks from people like the French that had already united in some way, and the Spanish, which were the dominant power at the time. Right? So one of the characters that Machiavelli is going to point to is Cesare Borgia, who is the son, illegitimate son, of one of the first Spanish popes, Alexander 16, Rodrigo Borgia, was his former name. So all kind of really interesting intrigue at the time, all the different political moves, but Machiavelli is right here at the center of this. And so in his descriptions of how politics works, he comes up with a sort of realist perspective. And I'm going to offer for your consideration that economics is trying to do something very similar to this. It's realism within thinking about the world rather than idealism. It's a contrast, I would say, would be useful if you're writing paper or if you just want to write test questions. Distinction between realism and idealism. Okay. So how should a good leader act? Should a good leader be kind? Should a good leader be honest? Right? What set of virtues do you want your leader to have? And are you drawing from an index of personal virtues when you think about what would make a good leader? Right? Is the list for what would make a good leader the same as the list of what would make a good friend? Okay? So Machiavelli asked this question. What if there are two standards? What if, instead of thinking how we can be good people, we want to know how we can make it so that our republic flourishes? And somebody that's good for leading a republic might have a completely different set of virtues than someone who's good at being human. So maybe Christianity, which was the dominant sort of theory at the time, has good advice about how to be a good person and get into heaven. But maybe leaders are making a choice of whether to get into heaven or establish a good republic here on earth. And those rules are different. This is a huge difference than the Old Testament version, which is a good leader did what God wanted and then flourished and knew that he was doing the right thing. So it's thinking about different standards, and I think that that's a really good example to think about in order to better understand what a science of political science or a science of economics might be offering is a completely separate set of principles that defy our personal notions of what we're acquainted with in social settings. All right, so Machiavelli is sort of credited sometimes as being the first political science. And he's looking through there and coming up with, well, what happens when you sort of project force in your local area? You start to be pretty brutal to your neighbors, you want to take over other cities, but then once you conquer, there's a different problem, which is disease domestically within the new territory. And you got to be really kind to the people inside your territory and really brutal to the people outside. And that's how you're going to expand. Remember, Machiavelli wants Italy to grow into the entire peninsula. There's no Italy until the end of the 19th century. All right? So here's the distinction I'm going to suggest, right? For these sorts of decisions about what your duty is as a good person, and then using this life wisely, you think of deontological or duty-based ideas. You may associate this with philosophers like Immanuel Kant, right? People have heard of Kant? Okay. Does it surprise you that economists are often called consequentialists? Only thinking about the results. Did it work? Not was it good, was it the right thing to do, but what was the result? So I'm suggesting that part of this division between idealism and realism is a distinction between deontological approaches or duty-based theories and what actually works or what is consequentially good. So can you do evil such that good results? Well, what would Kant say? All right, so Kale, if it's Amsterdam and you've got a whole family of Jews in your attic, and the Nazis knock on the door and they say, "Is anybody in your attic?" What do you say? You're the person who has Jews in their attic. I'm just asking you.
Probably not.
Anne Frank is in your attic.
No.
What are you going to tell them?
You don't think.
I'm married to a Nazi, so you can just call me a Nazi. So I'm asking you. I heard something. Anybody in your attic?
That's just the cats.
So Kant would say you're wrong. Right? How many people agree with Kant? In other words, it's not your duty to consider what the Nazis do with Anne Frank. Your duty is not to lie to other people. And maybe oversimplify. People that actually have taken other sponsors know more about this than I do. Right? But if you're doing a duty-based understanding, at least in its simplified form, you have duties to be good with reference to what is good and what is right for you, regardless of what results. And so you get into these weird situations where you do something that might seem to have extremely bad results. Right? So if you believe you shouldn't kill other people, but you have the opportunity to assassinate someone who's going to do great harm, then you do it and still be moral. Even if you can't be moral. In other words, like this is type of questions that Machiavelli was considering. If you have to assassinate someone to stop them from flying a plane into a building, and you go to hell as a result, they believe this, right? They believe that you will go to hell for killing someone. Should you do it anyway? Clearly, I don't know the answer to these questions. I don't think there is an answer. Maybe one day we'll find out. All right. So here's Cesare Borgia. Completely ruthless. You want to know how ruthless he is? Yeah. Okay. Romagna, right? The area around Florence. He's going to go up there and he's going to conquer. He's the general of the papal armies. So he sends his lieutenant in. He tells his lieutenant, like, we got a lot of troublemakers. You got to take care of them. So he does this brutal. Kills them randomly, confiscates their assets, all that kind of stuff. Creates total unrest in the area that they just conquered. Cesare comes up and says, I knew nothing about this. Arrests him, cuts him in half with a sword, puts him out in the middle of the piazza in the morning so everyone can see that his lieutenant has been murdered and has paid the price of the crimes that were committed in the area. All right? This was his longest serving, most faithful friend that he did this to. Right? And Machiavelli calls it brilliant. It's like a scapegoat. It works. Right? And peace ensued. And there were low taxes, and everybody liked it. Got rid of all the troublemakers and then sacrificed one of his most important as a result. It worked. Right? So is Machiavelli really recommending this? I don't think he's recommending this personal virtue, but he says that we have to consider that there are times where real leaders take these types of decisions. It's a very complicated, very weird sort of line of thinking. But I think it really emphasizes that there are people who are beginning to think about an alternative standard to sort of their intuition, what they're learning about moral virtues and personal life. So then they're developing this into something, right? We're trying to understand where all this comes from. Okay, so let's try to transition just a little bit. So we've got a distinction between idealism and realism. So idealism is everything that sort of operates according to the ideals or the things that I'm pursuing. Realism is sort of the trade-offs, to put it in economic terms. But can we have a separate sphere? Let's say that we still want morality. Let's say that Clay, you're a moral person, you go to a Sunday morning book club, I don't know if you do or not, but every Sunday you go, hear people read out passages from the book and inform you of morality and all that kind of stuff. But you're a nice person, so when you come back to your classmates and all that kind of stuff, you don't bring that stuff up because you can't assume that they agree with you about the source of morality. Right, so when we work in this group, we're going to talk about amoral decisions. We're going to use objective standards. We're going to use science, right? We're going to completely remove moral claims in the aggregate space, or at least outside of our element order, outside of our clubs that we belong to. Can we do that? Can we have an immoral space? People that believe morality is important have claimed that once you make that division, then, right, what are people going to do once we say we can't judge your character by my set of morals that I have at home and at church? So I'm going to remove all judgment about morality when we interact. What can you do as a result? And if you do something immoral, and you know that I think it's immoral, am I allowed to bring that up? No. Right? So maybe it's a race to the bottom. Right? So people that believe in morality want to expand the sphere of morality to these sorts of decisions would say, if you're not allowing me to bring my morality in, then it just incentivizes or lowers the cost of people behaving immorally. So that you actually can't achieve this sort of balance of without an amoral decision, without reference to morality.
Is that kind of like moral relativism? Like if we respect everybody to be moral, then nobody is.
Well, so that's a loaded topic, and I want to talk more about that. I don't know if you want to write your paper on it. But so to the extent that we're not allowed to reference any individual morality, then that's exactly what I'm talking about. But there's more to that.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, can we talk about duty or can we just talk about consequences? So it's no surprise to anybody that economists are always lumped in with the consequentialists, right? What happened to GDP? At the end of the day, we just want the facts. All right. So after you have Machiavelli, you have another sort of division. Right? So Machiavelli is back in the Italian Renaissance. You have the French Enlightenment. You have the rise of British empiricism. We talk about the Protestant Reformation. Bacon is a scientist that does most of his work under Queen Elizabeth and James I. So Bacon writes a whole bunch of scientific stuff. We'll talk about it in a second. But I want to mention Galileo. Right? What do you guys know? About Galileo? Right? Astronomer. Right? So Galileo is sort of the first big thinker after telescopes are really refined. So now he can see further than ever before. So the deal is, right, I don't know how much you guys know about the history of the different systems, but there's a Ptolemaic system, which means that the Earth is the center, and there's the Copernican system, which is the heliocentric, right, the sun is the center. And so the question is, I don't know if you've thought about it this way, before telescopes, why would anybody care? Like if you cannot see finely enough to make a distinction between the placement of planets, between these two systems, because it's a prediction of where the planets are going to be. It's like how you measure the system to decide which one is accurate, or more accurate. That's important. Constantly getting better system. Why would anybody care? Is there any benefit to Jim that he knows exactly where Pluto is going to be? Even though my daughter told me last night we don't know if there's craters on the surface of Pluto. That's the last thing she said before she fell asleep. But if we know where it is, does it matter if we know exactly where it is? It is a dwarf planet again, apparently. Because we're part of a generation that didn't have planet. Pluto as a planet.
It's a dwarf planet, but it's not a real planet.
So, does it matter that we know exactly where it's going to be in a week? To Jim. We're just speculating about Jim's preferences. If he's wrong, is he going to miss it? Is he going to notice? Okay. So if that's right, don't hear me saying physics is not important. For most of us, it's really hard to see the advantage of knowing the difference between the Ptolemaic prediction of where Pluto is going to be and the Copernican prediction. But there's a cost, right? Because what's the first thing that somebody, after they hear about Galileo, is going to pull out of their back pocket as a problem with the status quo? When you tell me that the Earth goes around the sun rather than everything else moving around the Earth. Call it everything. Yeah. Let's get more specific, right? So that's right, but why? What's the first problem that Galileo faced? Bacon's outside; he doesn't have to worry about any of this because he's Protestant. So they're already fixing all the problems with the previous worldview. Okay. What's Galileo going to?
Criticism, backlash from the church.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so I'm just seeing if anybody guesses what the major complaints of the Pope at the time was.
Does it have something to do with like humans sort of being the center of the universe, like God's focus on humanity and
Yeah, it feels great. Like sometimes when I have a bad day, I kind of go back to the Ptolemaic system because I like to be the center of the universe. It's true, right? There's a particular interpretation when interpretive lens that's really important with that. Anybody ever heard of Jericho? This town, what happened there? Wall fell down. I don't know if you're going back to the songs you were saying when you were a kid. But, right, wall fell down. Why? What happened that day?
They walked around it.
They walked around it, and then something happened, natural phenomenon.
Is the sun stand still?
Yeah, the sun stands still. So they're smart enough to understand that if you're telling me that the Earth goes around the sun and spins on its axis, if the sun stood still, it's not that something far away from us stopped. It's that the Earth stopped spinning. Right? What happens to the ocean when the Earth stops spinning? Yeah, we notice that. Right? That would be somewhere in the record. Right? So if it doesn't give you any better description, it's going to people start asking questions like that. Like they're going to want the whole Bible in common language too. Right? They want to know what else is in it. So this is threatening. So Galileo is perfect. He's funded by I think it's by the Medici, but just like all that whole group of people, the Borgias and the Medici are funding, they're doing all the paintings and all this kind of stuff, and intellectuals as well, writing books and things. He's causing a whole ruckus, right? So he gets the Inquisition, Bellamy comes in, and does a pretty good job of cleaning it up. He's like, okay, look, that's true for mathematics, but it's not true for tradition. Really interesting books written about this, right? Some of them by Robert Bellamy, about how that whole thing can be reconciled. But Galileo just won't shut up, right? In fact, he writes another book called The Dialogue Between Two Systems, right? One is the sort of Copernican system, and the other is the traditional system. And he gives it a dialogue, and they have names. And so he puts a nice scientist in one side, gives him a name, that's the other side, which is direct quotes from things that the current sitting pope has said, and he gives that character a title, a name, simpleton. Like in Latin, it's like simplicitous or something, but simpleton, right? This is all the book. The book doesn't get the imperator and it's banned. You can't distribute it, you can't read it and have it and still be a good Catholic. Didn't stop me. Cuts down on the book sales. I'm number one bestseller. And so they put him under house arrest. He's still writing letters with, I think her name is Catherine, the princess of some realm, teaching her about all this stuff, putting it in really simple terms, and she's circulating some of the descriptions. And just kind of pisses off the Catholic Church. So everything we know about Galileo is because he just wouldn't quit. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't just do what Bellamy said and keep it in a technical journal, with math. He actually put it into English, Italian, or vernacular. All right. Bacon didn't have this problem. Bacon did something much bigger, right? So both of these people are doing something that's really important. They're pushing back against an established, totally rigid system. Right? But think about it. Why is it that to be religious was to be reasonable, right? Like everything was the same, right? Fides et ratio, like the union of reason and faith, the union of sort of the church, and the church was the ones that had all of the universities. You're part of that tradition. Right? So Bacon didn't have this problem. Bacon could just blow it up. And the way he did it is he said, look, I'm writing this book, The Novum Organum Scientiarum. This is directly in reference to Aristotle's book, The Organon. Right? And what he's saying is that the entire scholastic period, now all this medieval thought, which is all stuff like how many angels fit on the head of a pen and all that kind of stuff, which seems silly, but I'll try to tell you why they did it that way. All of that stuff we're going to say is a bias of deductive logic. And what they did is they read Aristotle, and Aristotle has this whole thing in his metaphysics about the non-contradiction thesis, which is great. So let's come up with some things we think are true, we'll talk about it, and then we find something that contradicts, and we're saying, okay, we deduce this from a set of principles, so one of our principles has to be untrue if there's a contradiction, right? So then it's just a game of figuring out which principle is false and getting a better one that takes its place, one axiom, one first principle. So if we can eliminate anything that contradicts, then we have a coherent theory. That's really attractive, right? To people that have truths. Right? So if you have a Bible, and everything in the Bible has to be true, then it's just getting the right interpretation of everything. And that's just a game of getting the principles right. So therefore, once you have a true set of principles, you've correctly understood what all of the meanings and all the interpretations of the Bible are, then you can deduce anything in the world as a result. So you start changing some of our assumptions, you start contradicting. That requires a whole lot of moving parts to respond. So if the sun doesn't stand still in the sky, but the earth stops spinning, we now have to figure in the whole Copernican system into our story of Jericho. It's going to take time. That's what Melanie's asking for, just time. We have to adapt to this new thing and reconcile it. Bacon just says no, right? There's no reason to believe that we start with a set of premises. In fact, there's another approach suggested by Aristotle, which is the inductive method. So he's saying, let's just stop reading people that overemphasize the deductive methodology in the scholastic period, and let's go back and try to eliminate all of our biases. And this should be a place that sounds really familiar to those of you that are current in economics. This is behavioral stuff, right? We've all got these heuristics. Let's try to break down the heuristics. Let's get some true principles about how the world works. Let's do some experiments, laboratory experiments, and figure out how humans actually work, and get rid of the bad heuristics and replace them with good descriptions of how the world works, how humans are. Okay, so at the bottom of the page we have this idols of mind. I think we've got the idols of the tribe, the idols of the cave, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theater. So the idols of the tribe are overemphasis on sort of a narrative interpretation of nature. So you experience nature, you start to, in subtle ways, anthropomorphize nature. You read into things human motivations and narrative where they aren't there. Because we are a species that relies on narrative and our tribe and our belongings are true, so we just, in subtle and less subtle ways, do science by telling narratives as if there are morals in the natural world. Tell stories. So, searching for an example, something like but this is one of the ways in which we're biased. So Bacon is trying to push back on that bias. Another bias, this is the one that strikes home for me, is the idols of the cave. These are the sort of random thoughts that you become convinced of when you're working alone. Right? So you sit in your office, come up with a really good idea, congratulate yourself on how smart you are, and then you start believing it. That it's true, right? And it's without reference to other people. So one of the checks that we have on believing things is to surround ourselves with others and be subject to criticism. So really smart people convince themselves of a lot of things. The problems of being an expert is that you're really good at sort of rationalizing all of your impulses. So that's a possible problem. There's an idol of the marketplace. The relevant part here is just language itself. Even when we go out and exchange, we use language in different ways. If you've ever been in a conversation and just looked at someone exasperated and said, that's not what that word means. Right? We recognize that words adapt and come to mean things that are not precise. And it captures certain biases and habits of thinking that we're not really even aware of because we think words are precise in ways that they're not. Really hard. Like this is why when you go into philosophy, they labor words, break down very particular things. This is why German and Greek tend to be better languages for philosophy because they have less ambiguity in the words. All right, idols of the theater is just the recognition that rhetoric matters. Right? When you publish a new paper and put out new information about something that you've discovered, you're not just telling people, you're not just saying, here's some data, here's what I did to it, go replicate that yourself. You're telling a story. And you're using rhetorical skills to sell your story. And because that's necessary in order to communicate ideas, people that are more sophisticated at rhetoric will have better claims towards what we think is true than they should. All other things being equal. So if you want to just simplify this in very quick terms, it's just heuristics, right? You have all of these ways of thinking about the world that Bacon starts asking this question. But notice, right, like this is not Bacon's thought, but the reason I'm putting it here and emphasizing it is notice that this is what he's critiquing of what the scholastics did. They had all of these sort of intuitions that were sort of coherent and worked out, and they were a worldview, and he's giving us tools to start breaking down all of the assumptions that had just been left as assumptions. So by the time you get to David Hume is asking questions and saying, look, if we take Bacon's method of induction seriously, we don't know if the sun's going to come up tomorrow. But we're okay moving on to other questions because we've seen it happen so many times that we're no longer interested in verifying whether it will come up. We just ruled out all objections to that. Maybe there's some other reason we should be worried about the sun not coming up tomorrow, but we've pretty much played that question out. Let's move on to more interesting questions. Induction never really ends at true claims about the structure of the universe. It just says, is this claim that the sun's going to come up tomorrow pretty stable, such that we're not as concerned about it anymore? We move on to other things. Right? It's not quite positivism. It's not quite sort of this falsifiability thing, but that's the beginning of that whole argument, right? So instead of saying what is true and fundamentally true in a principle sort of way, induction opens up the opportunity just to reassert, rather than using syllogistic claims, reassert that there are certain things that we failed to contradict. All right. So, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that once you move from the Ptolemaic system to a Copernican system, once you get that, and Newton is not that far behind. Right? Think about how rapid in terms of human history, how rapid these systems are changing. Right? Science is moving at a new pace, right? Because of these sorts of paradigm shifts or changes. So once we get telescopes and we can start saying, no, Copernicus is better prediction of where Pluto is going to be. I don't think they can see Pluto. Whatever, I don't know exactly what you're trying to. You can see Mars. I can pick Mars out of the sky with my eyes. Jupiter, it's big enough you can see it. Venus you can see when it's really bright. It's not totally blocked out. Mars is red. But once you start getting the lenses, you can start trying to develop predictions of where the planets are going to be from year to year, day to day, month to month, all that kind of stuff. So then they keep going, right? Because the Copernican system has flaws that the Newtonian system fixes, et cetera, et cetera. So this rapid advancement in science is happening, and one of the reasons I'm telling you this whole story is that that's where economics starts coming in. We're going to have a science, an objective science of human interaction. Now, what Smith says about this is that all planets are easy, right? Precisely because when I observe a planet, and the planet doesn't know I'm observing it, and it doesn't change its behavior after I've observed it. We don't have to talk about quantum stuff, but we're just talking about Kale, right? Like once Kale knows I have a theory of his behavior, it's in his interest to change up his behavior. So maybe after class every day he goes down and sits in front of the fireplace in the front there. But if I show up, he's going to change his behavior. He's like, I'm too predictable. I'm going to mix it up. How much going to work out? The last thing I'm going to do is hang out with me in the fireplace after class. So human beings respond. So in psychology, they introduce this like the Hoffman effect. You know, right? People respond to being watched or observed. In quantum theory, there's quantum mechanics, observing, whatever. But Smith would say that what's really interesting about human behavior is that it's sort of infinitely complex in a way that natural motion of planets and other natural theories are not complex. They may be difficult mathematically to sort of resolve, but once you resolve them, that's it. They're not going to change as a result of your theory. Whereas human beings can actually change as a result of the theory you have about them. Seek arbitrage opportunities to change things out. Keep it interesting. Take a profit out of it. All right? So we're moving away from a sort of coherent or axiomatic system that's self-referential, and that's sort of a way of explaining a type of theology, into science, which is going to come up with a scientific description. And that's the goal. So if you have critiques against the physiography, if you have critiques against some of the early theories of economics, your critique might be that it's sort of too optimistic about what we can sort of predict. But the entire idea was to view human beings as just an extension of the natural world, having rules and patterns that are predictable. Does that make sense? It's a natural extension of the progress of science. All right, so just the example of astronomy, the Ptolemaic system, the Copernican system, Newtonian gravity. We've got in there like something else. I'm not an expert on physics, so I once asked a nuclear physicist friend of mine, who was over his house for dinner. I asked him to explain to me the Higgs boson theory and how that upset or contradicted Einsteinian theory or whatever. And he goes, I've tried to do that before, and it just never works. I don't explain things to a non-physicist anymore. And so I kind of looked sad, and he was like, well, you can talk German if you want. I'll do something that you can do. So how we progress down to Einstein, I don't know what's missing, and then the Higgs boson stuff I don't really understand. I can kind of get Newton, like an apple fell on his head, and he realized that small objects are attracted to large objects. I'm not even sure that's true, but it was good enough, right? It was good enough to like upset the older theory, which was the property of apples was to fall down, and they believed that they should be down, and anytime they got a chance to go down, they went down. Right? An apple was defined by the intrinsic motivation to be closer to the center of the earth. Right? Which comes from a system of fully articulating all of the principles of relationship between every natural object. But we've rejected all that, moved all that further along to the point where this is a really important thing to consider about the division of labor, right? If I can't understand physics and can't talk about it beyond just sort of the cartoon version that I was given when I was a kid, and somebody told me about Isaac Newton and apples, do I need to do that? Do I need to understand medicine in order to talk to my doctor? Do people need to study economics for years before they can talk about economics? Which things are specialized to the point where it's unrealistic to believe a non-specialist would even really understand the relevant material and what implications does that have for a social order? So, if everything works naturally, we have to worry about all of these different questions about fully understanding how better, more complicated systems. So an application of this to economy might just be, well, we're gonna come up with a development, right? So this development just happens to correspond with the grand history of the world I gave you about accumulating capital and becoming more productive, all right? So what we might conjecture, and we have to conjecture because we don't have written historical records of people that are hunter-gatherers that wrote, because language comes about through the division of labor in settling cities. Oral tradition can exist, right? We don't have the actual written record. People have speculated that there was hunter-gatherer, then agricultural, commercial, industrial, some stuff in the middle, manufacturing, service, and technology, and all of this is supposed to correspond really well with increasing capital, more productivity, and everybody being better off. But of course you assume it's better off because you bought into the whole theory that's baked in through progress and understanding this. The archaeologists go back and deal with some of these first claims. Did man settle in cities and then cultivate agriculture? Or did agriculture happen before they settled in cities? And the assumption was you had to be in one spot when you planted a field. Right? So what we're finding more evidence of is that the relationship between humans and wheat was a long process, and wheat was actually harvested before there was set civilization. There were sort of developed civilizations that would just return and harvest wheat over generations. And they got better off because it was a better food, more viable food source. But it was only after that they set up cities, permanent locations. Anybody like paleo or keto diet? So, just life expectancy over long periods of time goes up, but right at the point of civilization kind of dips. Less exercise, more wheat. So people always bring that out. But so dealing with these things, we can pick with the details of the evolutionary theory, but we've got a theory of how we got rich here. And it's just like any other system. We're constantly improving it or going back and changing some of the assumptions. It could be, like a switch from Ptolemy to Copernicus if you want, right? If that's what you think is going to happen. We built this theory and then it's time to knock down and get the new one. Or it could be small incremental changes, which I guess probably better explains the movement from Newton to Einstein to Higgs boson. Don't ask me about string theory. I even watched an episode of Charlie Rose on string theory and I still don't understand it. Nobody does. So, surely somebody has information that's useful that comes from understanding it. But that's a completely different understanding of gravity, right? Like gravity exists in a higher order dimension. I'll be good to even read science fiction that talks about string theory or uses it as a premise. So how you develop your theory is really important. All right. Here's just deduction and induction examples. I always like to use Sherlock Holmes for the deduction. It's axiomatic. He's able to predict what people did because he has a worldview that sees all of the different parts relating to each other like a field, and they're predictive of each of the different parts. That always bothered me. Right? Because, of course, everything Sir Arthur Conan Doyle gave us accurately predicts the actions of the character as we wrote it. It is truly axiomatic in the sense that nothing else can happen but what was specified. It's the internal relationships. But the inductive process is starting with observation and just slowly sort of ranking like statements, tentative statements, about which ones you're concerned less about validity of through experiments. And so when you think about science, you shouldn't be thinking about science proves what is true. What you should say is there are things that we've done enough experiments on that we're pretty comfortable with assuming are true because we have other things we want to do, other things that we want to think about. That's as good as it gets. That's like the most solid version, as opposed to the axiomatic method, which says what we're really trying to do is illuminate the true principles for which we take for granted and then deduce everything else. I will spend some time talking about a priori and a posteriori. I'll make a claim that these are not just synonyms for deduction and induction. But that will only matter if you're doing a big one in methodology, or if you want to make that point of the answers in the test. A priori is just before experience, and a posteriori is informed by experience. They seem really similar. I think they're distinct enough, at least for considering economic methodology, that I would work with both, if you're interested in methodology. Now, you have to have both. You have to have deductive systems and inductive. You have to balance these things out. All right. So David Hume is our first that sort of takes on this natural world, this Baconian sort of system through British empiricists, and starts applying it systematically to psychology, human nature, and what I'm calling neurocausal, or like we have moral psychology now that we use brain scans and things to look at the different claims that human beings, surprisingly, a lot of Hume's observations hold up. So whatever he was doing to infer things from the experiences around him, he was a pretty keen observer. It's not experimental data, right? He's not going in the laboratory and doing things, hooking people up to brain scans. He didn't have any of that. But it's amazing that 300 years later we were going back and looking at his writings to get experimental design questions. It's weird for me to suggest that Hume has some sort of axiomatic system. I'm not really saying that. I'm just saying that something is interesting about the approach that Hume took that was on the right track in terms of pulling things out that we were interested in. All right. So then that sets us up to talk a little bit about mercantilism. So how many people are presenting today? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So I probably need to give you guys at least 10 minutes, so we have about 15 minutes left, a little under 15 minutes to talk. Somebody should just stop. All right. So the first thing I have on here is mercantilism's sort of this obsession with gold and silver. A couple of reasons why I'm highlighting this. One, I think it helps understand the worldview at the time. If you try to reason through why that was such an important part of this whole system. And two, it gives us our firmest connection with how we think about current accounts today in macroeconomics, international macro. Why we give so much emphasis on current accounts? It seems sort of strange. All right, so here's my best case to sell you on why people care about gold and specie. Why do you need specie? Why do you need the actual hard money? Well, in a world with a lot of mercenary armies, it helps to be able to pay people in specie. There's real power to be able to pay in hard currency. So if your coffers are full, you can extend force. So one of the things that's important to remember is mercantilism is a theory of international diplomacy, and more than it is a theory of economics. But in order to do that, the new science of economics starts to emerge through a lot of speculation within the mercantilist school, which is why it takes this first big school of thought in the course presentation in the modern state, right before the classical school, right at the same time as physiograms. All right, so how do you get gold? Well, there's a balance of trade, right? You have more goods going out than you have coming in. So if you're selling goods, they give you gold, and if you can constrain how many goods that you're buying from abroad through a variety of policies, then you can limit the amount of specie that goes out. That's the whole theory. Okay? So it's a flawed theory, but why? Well, there's something called the price specie flow mechanism. Maybe it helps. So let's use. Maybe it helps when we're looking for circles. Goods are going out, gold and silver comes in. Very quickly within your domestic country, right, you're going to get a lot of gold. Is that a good thing? Well, at least if you want to pay a mercenary army, it's good. But very quickly there becomes a problem. Right? If if you have the same number of domestically produced goods and more specie, what happens to the price of your domestically produced goods? It just goes up. So it's the same number of goods with more money chasing the goods. It's your classic inflation. Right? So if I've got woolen coats domestically in England, and the price of those has risen, there's less specie in France, because we're going to use two countries in the entire world that we good economists to simplify the world, two countries. There are woolen coats in France that are now cheaper. This is a strong reason that people would try to find any way possible to buy coats in France rather than domestically. They're going to start figuring out really innovative ways to get those goods in the country because they're that much cheaper. The distinction between the prices is risen quite a bit because the species went out. So the way that will naturally balance is where species is relatively plentiful, it will be used to purchase items in the other country such that the price level is moderated between the two countries. Okay. So this idea that the current account really, really matters, that we can somehow maintain a constant current account surplus is difficult. Now you'll ask me, right? Like a modern country that maintains a constant current account surplus is China. How do they do it? I'll remind you that China doesn't have a very large financial industry, and that most of their financial services are done in a large part by buying U.S. sovereign debt. And that's part of the capital account, and that tends to balance out the current account. So when we think of the overall balance of payments, we're only aware of that question because we did a whole bunch of explaining to people through the price species flow mechanism why you can't maintain current account surpluses for long, unless you do capital or something like that. Or you can go into currency manipulation if you want to do that. Okay. Where else do we see these types of ideas? All right. I got a couple of, smirks in the last class when I talked about, look, let's say you had a country where capital was really, really plentiful and wages were very, very high. And immediately to the south of that country, in another country where capital was relatively scarce and wages were really low. What would your economic theory predict? Something's got to happen again.
Invest capital in that country to the south.
Yeah, right? Either capital's got to go to the south, or labor's got to come to the north. If you try to limit capital going to the south, or if you try to limit labor going north, you're going to push back against every principle that explains human motivation. Right? So it shouldn't be possible to do without consequences. What will happen eventually if you leave people alone is that wages will equalize. Now, notice that this is not a theory of politics, right? This is not saying that that's not going to have any impact on political labor or anything like that. But if I could get everybody to understand that factor payments are going to be equalized in their pay between any two countries over time, and just get them to do that, then we can have the real conversation about what does that do to the political social order and all that kind of stuff. I'd much rather have that conversation after we took the economics seriously. All of that comes from sort of critiquing sort of these mercantilist positions. But let's finish up our list of mercantilism. One of the things that I thought was interesting that took me a while to understand was that when we talk about free trade, we're talking about free trade domestically in a country. Right? Nobody's really interested in trading across these colonial empires because of this idea of trying to have specie or trying to have current account surplus. The way they want to maintain it is by colonizing and bringing in raw materials and adding value to those materials and selling them out wherever they can. But in order to do this, they liberalize domestically. Right? So the entire story of the colonies is a movement towards the federal system, which one of the key things about the U.S. Constitution is it prevented restrictions on internal commerce. So they commerce. So by creating sort of a free trade area within a country, that country liberalized and kept all of the rules similar within the country. That promoted trade within, domestic trade. So the first version of free trade that we see is within. So it's not much of an extension to say, Adam Smith would say things like, well, what if we got rid of these huge tariffs on wheat or oats or other cereal grains? I'll keep using the term cereal grains, but I mean, they call it corn. We think of corn as what they would call maize. But corn is rice, oats, wheat, everything. So if you're confused about which one I mean, just ask. But the corn laws were huge tariffs on the importation of wheat because we didn't want to enrich France by buying their wheat. What would happen if we went to war with them? They'd have all the wheat. You'd have no wheat grown domestically, we'd starve. Right? So we don't want to have this international trade. But within the country, we're going to advance trade. So it wasn't a big extension for someone like Smith to say, what if we applied those same principles internationally? Well, another part is growth in population. You can't have growth in population without a radical change in the way that people understand labor. Labor is no longer a liability, it's an asset. It's a huge change. I would suggest that you can understand sort of political decision-making and warfare over time by looking at surplus population. Because if you don't use your population to wage war, then you're going to hit famine and start overpopulating. It's a relatively new theory that you can think about labor productivity and that labor actually is an asset as long as they're employed in gainful pursuits. So why do I think that's important? Well, here's what population does. Right, so this is 1600, 1750, 1800, and then there's a huge takeoff. This is world population growth. We've got the Greek classical period, the Islamic Renaissance, China's Neo-Confucian Renaissance, and then the European Renaissance, which immediately was followed by something here going on with population growth.
What year does mercantilism come around?
We're right in this year. Here's just London, right? In 1760, 750,000. 1801, we've grown quite a bit. 1815, another growth. But notice 1760 to 1815, right? 55 years, that doubled the population. Doubling of the population of London. Here's something I just want to emphasize, and don't. One of my roles is to try to get you guys to remember stuff and solve dramatic stories. So, infant mortality is declining. Think about a world in which you don't name your kid for the first year or two of their lives. Why? Because by age 5, 50% of children are dying.
I mean, did they use like a limited number of names so it could get confusing if multiple children had?
If you go to graveyards at the time, it just says baby Thomas. That would be the tombstone for anybody under 1 or 2 years. Think about what that means, right? Like I'm spending a lot of time holding my baby and nurturing my baby and talking stuff at home now. That kind of connection is important for the development of the kid and neurology. We know all this stuff about the first 2 years of life, right? In a world where you have a 50% chance of that kid dying, you're distancing your emotions. You're protecting yourself rationally and not taking that bond as seriously, right? That's going to have systematic effects. Let's think about the relationship between men and women. If women are 1 in 9 likely to die in childbirth, if you're not good odds, I wouldn't recommend taking them in Vegas. Right? That's going to affect the type of relationship that marriage is. Right? So what I am telling you, right, is that there's a serious change in the material conditions as a result of some of these changes in the way of thinking that have profound cultural effects in the way that we relate to each other. Or this is one of my major claims about the humanization over time that results from this change in way of thinking. My claims are clear. My job for the first test is to convince you that economics arose and was like this wonderful, incredible change in the way we thought, and all of life and prosperity happened as a result. Second test, we're critiquing that. Right? But in order to critique something, I have to give you I have to set it up. I mean, this is the humanization coming about directly as a result of this change in the way of thinking about society. All right. Here, just to further hit the point, the fraction of a laborer's, mechanics in general labor, a fraction of mechanics income spent on bread, so it's the total income, how much of that income is spent on enough bread to eat. And this is really bad for paleo people. It's all bread. But, and then this is the wage, right? So what we're saying is the wage is increasing at the same time the actual price of buying bread is not increasing at the same rate, so that the real wage is going up over this period of time. Even after the huge population boom. So this is a major problem with thinking of modern urbanization as being just a dismal thing, right? Yes, population spikes. Yes, people are in cities. Yes, conditions are bad according to prior standards, but infant mortality is dropping, right? It's hardly the case that Dickens makes in the 1830s and 40s, right? It's not that it's this miserable state compared to what came before. It's just not there yet. It's still miserable. It's not as perfect as we would like it. And I think that's a completely different interpretive lens than what we normally get. Because if you go back to 1750, the world was far worse than even the Dickensian world that we're talking about when we get into poorhouses and living stuff in the next class. All right. You guys won't have a chance to present if I don't shut up. So. Let's do it first.